Hello, and welcome to our first developer day of 2024 for our winter release. We've been hard at work on what's next at Retool, especially with regards to performance and the extensibility of our platform. Before we get into all of what's new at Retool and how you can access it, I want to quickly recap some of the biggest shifts from this past year. First, in 2023, we made Retool a batteries included product. While you can still connect to any resource through our connectors, we shipped 5 built-in resources, starting with our GA of Retool Database in March. Retool Database is a fully managed Postgres database, and you can use it to build apps on top of, or you can ETL data with Retool workflows. We also shipped a built-in file store where you can put anything from images to PDFs without any setup. From there, we shipped Retool Email along with 2 new AI capabilities. First, we shipped Retool AI, so you can use AI out of the box in apps and workflows. You can use AI in Retool to help you write SQL or JavaScript, or you can use Retool AI actions to summarize text, categorize images, or generate new ones. To pair with Retool AI, we also ship native vector support, so you can upload documents or point Retool at sites on the web to generate embeddings for retrieval. With our new chat component in your data and Retool workflows, you can build chatbots on your own data in minutes. Next, we did a complete redesign of our IDE with updated code editing and a bunch of new components, including ground-up rewrites of table and list views, optimized for data-heavy apps. But we didn't stop there with performance. With our new runtime that shipped in 2023, Retool apps saw a boost to be as much as 75% faster, and we will be doubling down on performance in 2024. We have new features on the way, like advanced debugging and multi-screen management for complex apps, so you can build large, data-intensive experiences across multiple screens without splitting them into separate Retool apps. We also expanded from beyond internal tools to make it so you can really build any software inside of Retool. With Retool portals and Retool embed, you can build end-to-end branded apps for your customers, vendors, and partners. In October, we graduated Retool workflows from beta to GA, bringing with it a whole swath of new features to strengthen your backend processes. We'll talk a little bit more about workflows later. Finally, we made it easier for large enterprises to use Retool at scale. ToolScript, our new serialization format, and multi-element branching make source control much easier and highly legible for reviewers wherever you do your code reviews. So while we had a really big year, it's important to state that so much of it is made possible from you. Those of you that watch these events, give feedback in the comments, participate on our community forums, and help other builders in Discord. So let's get back to today and what's new at Retool. First, let's start with how you might be using Retool today. There's a couple different ways you might be hosting Retool. You can let Retool host for you in the cloud, or you can self-host on your own infrastructure. How you host Retool is up to you. If you're on cloud, you're always using the latest deploy of Retool. If you self-host, you're in control of when you upgrade. Up until now, we've released a new version of self-hosted Retool every 2 weeks. Starting today, we're making self-hosted upgrades more straightforward by splitting into 2 self-hosted release channels, a quarterly stable release and a weekly edge release. As you might expect, we'll come out with a new quarterly stable release once every 3 months. This will be our most stable version of our self-hosted product, and one that will support with at least 6 months of fixes and backports. Our edge releases will come out each week and include the absolute latest Retool features. We're making this change to give you a clear path of when to upgrade Retool and which version to upgrade to, depending on your organization's internal tooling strategy. If you're not upgrading that often today, we'd encourage you to staff to our quarterly releases so you can still take advantage of bug fixes and security patches. If you're able to upgrade more frequently and want to access the latest features and betas while still self-hosting, our Edge releases are a great fit. All right, so now let's get into what's new. From a product perspective, we've really thought about how much we can make Retool more powerful for our builders. One of the ways we're making the product more powerful is by making it more extensible. So let's start with 3 new developer features about extensibility. First, we made it so you can use the platform in more ways with Retool CLI and a bunch of new Retool commands to go with it. Second, we've made it so you can fully extend the boundaries of Retool with an all-new version of custom components, letting you build React components you can drag and drop into your apps. And lastly, we wanted to take extensibility to the backend as well with Retool RPC. Retool RPC lets you call functions you make available from your codebase directly and securely from Retool apps and workflows. So let's jump into a demo and see these live. In this demo, let's say we're a hardware producer called Apex Automations, and we're managing a lot of inventory to manufacture our products. So to start, let's see how we can use the new Retool CLI. So let's start by seeing what the CLI can do. You can see all the commands available here. And I have this inventory in a CSV, so I'm just going to go ahead and upload it to Retool database. And that's all we have to do. Now it's in Retool DB, and let's check it out. This is pretty nifty, but we can do a lot more with this together with some of our other built-ins. Let's go ahead and use AI to build an automation that processes our inventory in our warehouse daily and sends me an email with our inventory value and current stock. To do this, we'll hop into Retool workflows, which are the logic layer of Retool, where we can trigger complex automations using crons or webhooks. So we have our database here, and now let's go and create our workflow that we're going to generate with AI. So we'll go over and create a new workflow. And now we're into the workflows welcome screen. We're going to go down to the bottom left here and choose to generate a workflow with AI. I'm going to select my resource to give it the context of my inventory. So now I want to get an email every night at 9 p.m. that has our current inventory value in the subject, and it's going to have our full inventory in the body of the email. And I'm going to have that just be sent in a markdown table. So now we can go ahead and click generate, and this will take a few seconds to go ahead and generate our workflow. So we'll close this out. And then once this starts to create our workflow for us, we'll see it just build up block by block. Now we're starting to get our workflow. You saw a SQL query flash in, you saw one code block. Now we're getting our second code block, and now we have our email block. So 4 blocks makes sense based off the prompt. You can see on the left here, we have our triggers, and let's turn on this 9 p.m. trigger that I asked for in the beginning. We can go over here and quickly see our workflow in a tree view, and then we'll jump back into our graph view. From here, let's go and actually look at this workflow and what it's doing. So you can see I have that trigger to the left, then the SQL query to select start from my inventory. I have the inventory value generation. I have the markdown table, and then the email itself, which is in markdown. So let's go ahead and run this and send that email. I'm going to close this out and quickly show a couple other things in workflows that might be new. First is code search. So you can actually jump over here and we'll just search for markdown, which we know is somewhere in this workflow in the code. It looks like it's in our code 3 block. I also have libraries. So I have some built-in libraries, but I could also add my own custom libraries in JavaScript and Python. Now we'll go down here to our run history. You can see our run, and it looks like everything ran well. I can see my SQL query. I can see the output there. I can jump and look at one of the code blocks. It looks like this is the markdown table. And then I can see the email, and it looks like it's sent. So now we can jump over and check our email, do a quick refresh. And there it is, our inventory value in the subject and our full inventory in the body, all written with AI. All right, so you just saw 2 of our built-ins in action, and we got up and going with our inventory pretty quickly. But let's get into the front-end extensibility I was talking about with custom components. So here I have my custom component inside of VS Code. It uses React and it uses the React Flow library. And not only do you see my custom component in action here, you see the associated CSS and initialization for that. We go ahead and we scroll up, you can also see I'm able to do things like use Retool state, or I could use Retool event handlers right from inside my custom component. So if we go over here and we look at the manifest as well, you'll see not only do I have a single supply chain component, I also have this hello world component. So when I actually export this and I go ahead and deploy it to Retool, I can actually have multiple components inside of library. You can see for this component, I'm expecting a journey of type object with 2 empty arrays to initialize it. If we actually go and we deploy this now from the command line, we can run yarn deploy, and we'll see that it's successfully deployed to my instance. So now we can go from here and let's use this in an application. So here we have our table of shipments, and what we want to do is provide a detailed view of each shipment that contains our custom component. So to start, we're going to go ahead and create a drawer frame, and we're going to drag that into the right side of the canvas. So we can see our drawer frame here. We're going to title it Shipment Details, and everything looks pretty good so far. The one thing this doesn't do yet, though, is it's not wired up to our table on click. So what we want to do is when a row is selected inside of our table, make it so that our details view actually shows. So we'll switch this to control the component and we'll have it show the drawer frame. So now if we collapse our inspector and we click, it will show our shipment details view when we click on a table cell. Now we can see our custom components are included in the app. So we're going to scroll down and we're going to add a custom component, our supply chain component, into the shipment details view. It doesn't show anything yet because you can see it's just passing 2 empty arrays. But I'm going to size this up and then I'm going to actually bring in some additional data before I populate this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a key value component. And I'm going to drag that in. And I'm going to use this key value component just to show how we can get the data from the selected row in the table and start to have some text in our details view. So we'll go here, we'll do table1 dot selected row, and we start to see our data, and it all shows up in the key value component right here. So now we want to go and actually go about getting data into our supply chain component that we set up here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to collapse this inspector for a second. I'm going to trigger it, and you can again see no content is yet provided. So we'll go back here. We're going to go and we're going to actually do the same thing. We're going to say table1.selected row, but this time we know that journey is where we actually have an object that has our edges and nodes for our custom component. So you can see here it automatically built our tree with this component that's going to California. You can see it walk through this React flow tree. We'll do another one. This one QA failed. So you can see it, the quality assurance is red, and we can see that on the details view. Now that we have our custom component up and running, let's shift back to backend extensibility with Retool RPC. So I'm going to start by showing some really simple server-side code. That is how I initialize the RPC server and register it. It takes my API token and a resource I created in the resources section of Retool, and I'm going to use it in the prod environment. So we have a few lines of configuration, and then we're off and running. So we're here in VS Code, and we can see the same initialization logic I was talking about to initialize Retool RPC. But you can also see a set of custom functions that I've registered, things that are simple like hello world, where I can define the arguments, and things like hello world with permissions, where I can actually use permissions because we know the context of the caller and use group names or user emails to validate who can actually run this function. We have some more logic inside of here. And then once we get to the end, we have RPC listen. And that sets up everything so we're ready to go. So now we can switch into our command line. We can go ahead and run our example code, and you'll see that the process starts running. If we go into the product, We can go now and we can create a new resource query. And we're going to use our RPC resource. So you can see our node RPC server here. We'll go and create that. And you'll see it already selected that first hello world function. But I could use really any of the functions that are available inside of here. And you could use really any functions from your code base. And you'll see that I can do my first name, my last name. I can go ahead and save, and then I can run this. And we'll see we get the output of hello, Matthew Isabel. So everything looks pretty good with this first function. So now we can call another one. We can use the permissions test here. And we'll try the same thing. We know that I was not granted permissions on the server, and you'll see this fails and doesn't work. So you just saw a couple functions run from our server, and you could really call any set of scripts, any complex logic that lives server side from your Retool apps and workflows. So far, we've covered a lot of the extensibility of the platform that's now available for developers. We saw Retool CLI in action to get data quickly into Retool. We saw AI create a new workflow for our inventory updates. We saw custom components in use with a custom React component for managing our supply chain. And finally, we saw Retool RPC make functions on my server available inside of Retool. Now let's see another way we've extended the current surface of Retool with our latest launch, Retool Forms, a form builder that lets you create forms directly on top of your database, integrated with the rest of Retool. So let's go ahead and create a form to collect customer support information. Now we can go ahead and when we start and create our form, we can either connect it to an existing Postgres or MySQL database, or we can start from scratch on top of Retool DB. So we're going to start this one from scratch on Retool DB, and we'll create our blank form. From here, we can go ahead and set our form title and description. So we'll say Apex support, and let's give users a little bit of info to know that we want to get their information on whatever seems to not be working. So now we go here, we'll add a new form component. So we can select from a bunch of components. And the first thing we want to get from our users is their email. So we let them provide their email, and then we're off to add another component. In this case, we want to add and get the product serial number. So we'll go over and we'll say product serial number. And now we've captured two forms so far that will show up in our database once we're collecting our form. We'll create one more that is a text area that is really just whatever the customer problem might be with our product. So we'll say what seems to be the problem. And that's a form pretty quickly that when we go ahead and publish and share with our users, it will write directly to our database. So we'll go ahead, publish form, and we're good to go. We're able to collect submissions, and let's see our form in action. All right, so we just saw our Retool form, but let's take our customer support tickets that we get, and let's use AI and Python to help route, categorize, and translate tickets. So let's take a look at this ticket workflow I've already built out. You can see it's set up to take the same input parameters we put into our form. So we have an email, a serial number, and whatever the issue might be. In this case, we're testing with the bottom part fell off. So let's look at this bottom part of the workflow, which is the categorization using Retool AI to say, which bucket does this ticket belong into? Is it a manufacturing defect, a software issue, Bluetooth, or none of the above? And you can see inside of here, we also included our manufacturing docs with Retool vectors. So we provide some additional context about how the manufacturing product works, maybe some parts and components, in case those are mentioned inside of the ticket. Now, if we go up here, we can see there's a translation block. And this is really a Python block using a custom library. So if we go over to libraries here, you can see that I've included this Google Translator library, and I could go in and include any custom JavaScript or Python library as well. This is just doing a simple translation of our issue into Spanish. And then finally, we're sending this data into Snowflake. So let's quickly just see a test run of this workflow. We go ahead and press run. We'll wait to see this output. And it looks like everything is running pretty smoothly so far. So you can see if we jump into send to Snowflake, We can see the data that was successfully created as a new record. If we go to categorization, we can see it was tagged correctly as a manufacturing defect. And then we can see our translation inside of here. While this is pretty nifty, I actually want to go and take our form from earlier, and whenever a new form input is provided, let's just call this workflow. So let's go over to Retool Forms. So we'll go to Forms, and let's go to Apex Support. So we have our form here, and I can go over to Workflows, and I'm going to choose our ticket workflow. This is the parameters. We've set them as email, serial number, and issue. So this is pretty good to work out of the box. I'm going to press save. And now we've linked our input form to our actual workflow. So now that this is saved and this is published, we can make sure this is updated. And let's go to our form. And we can try this out by saying Isabel at retool.com. I can say my serial number is 123. And then let's say the Bluetooth is broken. So we'll submit this, and it looks like everything worked. And now let's go back and let's go to our workflow. So if I go to the run history, I see one right here. And let's look at this one. Start trigger. It's my Retool email, my serial number, and the issue that the Bluetooth is broken. So this went ahead and on form submission just called our workflow as we expected. And let's go and check our AI categorization, and it correctly determined that this is a Bluetooth connectivity issue. So we were able to just go from a form that we created earlier to a workflow that uses custom libraries and AI, and the form just triggered the workflow for us. So we were able to send that data immediately into Snowflake. All right. So we went through a ton of new capabilities that we've added to the builder experience, making it possible for you to extend Retool in almost every part of the product. As we expand the surface area of the platform, more and more use cases are possible. As you build these use cases out and you add more users and teams, you'll need Retool to scale with you. In addition to making Retool more extensible and reliable, we've been focusing on making it as frictionless as possible to centrally manage distributed building. And to talk more about running Retool at multi-team scale, I'm going to pass it over to my teammate, Lizzie.
Thanks, Matt. Like Matt said, we've been talking so far about enhancements Retool has made to improve the reliability and extensibility of the platform. Not only is building Retool more powerful than ever, it's also never been easier to get more of your team members using Retool. Previously, onboarding a new team to Retool required closely managing permissions and folders in the UI to ensure complete isolation of work across teams. In some cases, it even meant deploying Retool all over again. This caused unnecessary administrative burden and a significant slowdown when onboarding new teams or use cases. To solve for this need, allowing for distributed building with centralized governance, we are excited to promote both Spaces and the Developer API to GA. Spaces are isolated Retool development environments for different teams or projects on top of shared underlying infrastructure. For example, if my Retool organization is hosted at apexretool.com, my child spaces then exist on the same infrastructure under subdomains for each team. You can think of Spaces as giving you a truly multi-tenant platform, with the option to share elements like apps and configurations like source control, or scope them to each space. In this example, we've shared theming, branding, and our SSO configurations across child spaces, while ensuring that each space has its own Git repository and source control config. Admins can create a space in the UI in just a few clicks. All you need is a name, description, subdomain, and preferences on what you'd like to copy over from your admin space. Once invited, users can access child spaces in complete isolation of the admin space and of other child spaces. At scale, you can also create and manage spaces with our Developer API. In conjunction with Spaces, we released a set of endpoints for Retool admins to systematically manage users, organization configurations, and more. Rather than having to take the same repetitive action again and again in the UI, Retool admins can now automate many administrative tasks. To access the API, organization admins can go to Settings, API, and provision themselves a token with scoped access. You then reference the token in a REST API resource. Now that we've covered both Spaces and the Developer API conceptually, let's apply both to the process of requesting and provisioning a new space for Apex automations. Let's say I'm the engineer in charge of managing Apex Automation's Retool instance, and our accounting team is interested in getting started on Retool. Ahead of time, I've set up a form on Slack that collects basic information from my requester on their team, use cases, and group preferences. Once submitted, I receive request details that I can either approve or deny. On approval, I kick off a workflow, which was built on top of our Developer API and the Google Sheet that collects responses from my Slack form. I'll go ahead and approve the request now. Based on my requester's submission, this workflow creates a new space and sets up SSO, theming, built-in groups, and more, all according to my organization's preferences. Let's walk through the workflow step by step. The workflow is triggered via a post request to its unique webhook URL, which I kicked off in Slack. From there, I'm retrieving the requests for Spaces from the Google Sheet where my Slack Forms responses are stored. I'm then doing a quick transform to reformat some of the form entries from the sheet into Boolean values. Next, I'm executing a post request to the Spaces endpoint. Referencing the values of the access request from the Google Sheet, I'm submitting a name, domain, and options, such as whether or not to copy SSO and theming settings in the JSON body. In my case, Apex Automations will share the SSO configuration and theming of the admin space to ensure all child spaces are secure by default and leverage the same design system. Apex also wants to make sure that every space has source control attached. So I'm using the source control endpoint to establish a connection with GitHub for my new space. Each space can have its own repository to ensure complete isolation of code across teams. Now that the space exists, I'm using the getGroups endpoint to make a request to the child space. Importantly, I can still use my same admin space API token to make requests of a child space. I need these group IDs to include in my last request, sending invitations. My final step before I invite users is to combine the user group preferences submitted in the initial request with the group IDs I just retrieved from the child space. This returns an array of objects with the user invite email and a group ID they should be invited to based on my requester's input form. You could also do this systematically in your Retool SSO configuration by mapping groups in your identity provider to groups in Retool. Finally, I loop through this array and set out invites to all of my users to join their respective group in the space. When the workflow is finished running, I get a Slack confirmation that a space has been successfully provisioned. Should the workflow ever fail for whatever reason, I've set up a global event handler to notify me via Slack of a run failure. Taking a look now in the debug panel, I see that this workflow ran successfully. I'll hop back into Slack now to see the notification that the space was successfully created. Just like that, I've onboarded a team to Retool in one click while maintaining all of the guardrails like SSO and role-based access control that my organization requires. Looking forward, I can now use the Developer API to both observe uses and maintain my Retool instance. For example, I could use a dashboard like this one on top of the API to take action on users' access requests. Or I could use a Retool event, a workflow triggered in response to Retool lifecycle events like user created or password reset, in conjunction with the Developer API. In this example, I'm using the API to add additional user metadata at the time of invite, such as the office location of a user, and using my SendGrid server to completely white label my invitation. Let's take a quick look. The trigger in this case is on invite. Every time a user is invited, this workflow will run with a JSON parameter including the user invited email. I start my workflow by grabbing all of the invites from the API and filtering to the specific user reflected in the JSON body of the start trigger. I then add a user attribute, in this case, the office location, to the invited user via the user invite endpoint. User attributes are particularly useful for pieces of metadata that are not captured by your SSO provider, but are relevant to app building, such as an employee's office location, a profile photo URL, or a user's membership level. Finally, because I don't want my users to get any Retool branding, I'm completely white labeling the email invitation my user receives to reflect Apex Automation's design guidelines. And I see in my email that I received an invite link complete with Apex branding, and my user now has its office location set to be referenced later in the current user object. Using the Developer API and event triggers allows you to have more control over your user's experience in Retool, from their invitation to which data or components they see in apps based on their user attributes. These are just the beginnings of what you can accomplish with the Developer API and Retool events across all your spaces. To put it simply, as more and more teams gain access to Retool, Retool will scale with you. Using Spaces, Retool events, and the Developer API, scaling and maintaining Retool is now significantly less time-consuming and equally as secure, leaving you and your teams more time to get building.
Thanks, Lizzie. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the extensibility of the platform to how Retool scales across teams. Thank you all so much for joining. Look out for some updates in chat, and let's head over to the live Q&A.